I'm really happy to be here. I spent about 3 hours this morning in a traffic jam, which gave me an opportunity to think back on my life and re-examine my goals and also think about the role that Ottawa has played in all of this. I've just had the pleasure of sitting next to Roberto, where he's organizing a conference on limits to growth, which will commemorate the 40th anniversary of its birth. It was first proclaimed publicly down at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. in March of 1972. And so in March of 2012, there's going to be a day-long symposium really around the birth of limits. But actually, the conception of limits, if I might stretch the metaphor a little bit, took place up here, and more or less 40 years ago today. I still remember vividly being out at Montebello at a meeting organized by the Club of Rome and by the Governor General to Canada, in which for the first time my team briefed the members of the Club of Rome about the research that we were doing for them. It was an interesting experience in many ways. It showed how naive I was, and probably still am. I thought that we would get off into the implications of our work, but I found during my presentation that we were being constantly stopped by people who didn't understand the basic concepts. Things like exponential growth, limits, positive feedback, and so forth. So after that meeting, we went back to MIT, and I said to Donella, my wife, we need a little sort of 10-page dictionary which would summarize all these words in a way so that we hand that out ahead of time, and then I can get off into the real stuff. So she wrote the 10 or 12-page dictionary. We sent it out to all the Club of Rome members, and it came back copiously criticized and red marks and question marks. And so we said, well, okay, I guess 12 pages was too little. It needs to be a 25-page dictionary. So we wrote a 25-page elaboration. We sent that out to the whole Club of Rome. And again, it came back full of suggestions and criticisms and comments and so forth. And the third iteration was a little book called Limits to Growth, which was not actually what we had set out to write. But Roberto's father, when he saw it, said, no, this is the one I want. And so he took it, and there we are. So 40 years ago, I was up here at Montebello, and I must say, people still don't understand the basic concepts, except probably you do. So I'm hoping we'll be able to pick up where I left off 40 years ago. This is actually the second time I've given my voice to my thoughts on this, under this topic. It's too late for sustainable development. I wrote an article by that name back in 1997. It was published by the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Munich. And I was thinking about that as I was sitting in the traffic jam this morning. Topic is the same. Most of the basic ideas are the same, but now we have a lot more data. And I do have some new analogies, which I'll be able to use for you. I used the emperor's new clothes as a kind of a metaphor last time. I can do a little bit better than that. Also, emperors have kind of fallen out of favor, probably, since then. So the first question is, of course, what do we mean by sustainable development? If it's too late for it, you know, what's it too late for? I was recently asked to write the preface for a new book on sustainable development, and the author claimed to have identified over 100 different definitions of sustainable development, which means that the term has become ubiquitous and essentially meaningless. And indeed, really, we don't know what it means anymore, if we ever did. Attempts to define it fall into two general categories. There's what I might call the political definitions, promulgated by Brundtland and others, which are along the line, everybody gets what they want now, but they just get it in a way that doesn't encroach on the future being able to get what they want. I call it the political definition because politicians love it. It doesn't force them to make any hard choices. There's also an ecological definition of sustainable development of a sort maybe promulgated by Herman Daly and his colleagues, where you look at the biophysical characteristics of the planet and start to come up with some ideas. You can't use renewable resources faster than the rate at which they're regenerated. You can't dump stuff into sinks faster than they can be assimilated, stuff like that. The advantage of the first one is everybody likes it, but nobody doesn't really cause them to do anything. It's, the phrase is basically being used to justify doing what you already wanted to do anyway. The second approach is more meaningful, but we have had a hard time converting it into any sort of action. It's very abstract, this notion of renewable resources, regenerating and so forth. The best job of the second, which is where my predispositions lie, has been done by Matthias Wackernagel, a Swiss scientist who actually did his PhD in Canada and came up through his doctoral work with this concept of the global ecological footprint. Now, it's extraordinarily difficult to, and probably even impossible, to do a really objective, precise job of talking about global carrying capacity as anything more than kind of a notional concept. But Matthias has done certainly much better than I could do. He's simplified. He's talking about a global carrying capacity which has the wonderful benefit that it doesn't deteriorate if you overshoot it. No real system behaves like that, but at least it avoids a lot of debates with politicians. Matthias's analysis tries to convert all of our use of non-renewable stuff, energy and materials, into their renewable equivalents. Comes up with basically a designation of how many hectares of land and water each of us requires to generate this stream that we're currently using. So we all have a personal footprint. You could talk about the footprint for this club and so forth. Looking back, Matthias concluded that when our first book was written in 1972, we were globally at about 85% of the global carrying capacity. Now we're at 140% and accelerating, which means that every year we're using 40% more resources than can be reproduced renewably by the planet. Now, the question comes, so what? Amory Lovins is a good friend of mine, and he has a saying I like very much, which is, if something can't go on forever, it probably won't. And it's not going to go on forever, that we use more of the earth than it can reproduce. But the interesting question is, when's it going to stop, and how's it going to stop? Implicit in the notion of sustainable development is, as that term is generally used, is it will stop sort of automatically in ways that we're not too sure about, but are somehow embedded in the economic system. And it will stop in an orderly way, and it will stop far enough in the future that we don't need to worry about it now. Because I only have 7 minutes left, and because what I say really depends on where you're at on this matter, I'm going to just take a quick poll. Assume for the moment that growth is going to stop. That is, we're going to quit seeing continual exponential expansion. I don't want to, I can argue that, but I don't want to get into that argument at the moment. Let's assume that that's the case. When is it going to happen? And I'll give you a choice. Is it going to happen before 2050 or after 2050? And when I say growth, let's take an indicator, population, global population. We do have relatively reliable statistics for global population, relatively. So my question, what do you think? Is global population going to peak out and start going down before 2050 or after? You have 1 minute to think about it. Before 2050, raise your hand. Everyone who thinks it's going to stop after 2050, raise your hand. Well, we're about evenly split on that. Second question, how is it going to stop? Is it going to stop in a kind of a nice, orderly way? Or is it going to stop through some sort of disorderly way, which is what we might loosely term overshoot and collapse? Time's up. How many think it's going to stop in an orderly way? Raise your hand. How many think it's going to stop in a disorderly way? Raise your hand. Okay, we have much more consensus about that. Let me say, I'm positive, personally, on the basis of my scientific work, it is going to stop in a disorderly way. I'm not sure if it's going to stop, if population growth will stop before or after 2050. That gets off into a whole set of issues related to equity and other things, which I won't get into today. But for the moment, let's assume it's going to stop in a disorderly way, and we don't like that. It didn't need to be that way. If we had gotten started back in 1970 on these issues, when the globe was still at 85% of its global carrying capacity, we could have achieved sustainable development. That means we could have had development, which we understand to mean growth, and it could have been sustainable. Now we can't. When you're at 140% of what's sustainable, you can't continue to grow and then keep it. We're going to go back down one way or another. So I'll save the speculation about that to the question period. So what do we do about it? Well, this is a meeting about economics, ostensibly. So let me share with you a few thoughts I have about the implications of this shared sense we have about the economic systems. Economics, of course, is not something separate. It's a part of our governance system. We have politics, we have ethics, we have the church, we have lots and lots of different components to our governance system. And they vary from one region to another, one person to another, and so forth. But economics, the motivation by price, is certainly a very extremely important one and has the attribute that it is the one which tends to feature prominently in conversations. You know, when there's, you don't see the people who are trying to save the euro right now calling in sociologists or philosophers. Although, in fact, I think they might have more useful advice than the economists do. They're bringing in the economists. So let's think about the economics. I'm going to use, because it's in the media a lot, the example of climate change. I could use lots of other examples. I could use peak oil or peak gas or the widening gap between the rich and the poor or lots of other things, but let's use climate change as relatively straightforward. It shows us two ways that economics has to change. I'll take them in order. First is this question of criteria. Recently, Lord Stern in England published under his name a huge study about climate change. The basic conclusion of which was it's real, it's going to be serious, and we ought to be investing now to minimize its consequences. It was criticized, of course, by others, and let me take one critic, William Nordhaus, another economist, prominent Yale economist in the United States. Nordhaus said about the Stern report, see, it was a dilemma for him because normally the economists say, well, this person is a lousy economist, therefore what can they know about climate change? But in this case, Stern was a reputable economist. So what Nordhaus said was, the discount rate is too low. You know, I don't remember what Stern used, 2% or something like that. And Nordhaus said, no, that's too low. The discount rate needs to be much higher. If you make it much higher, then it doesn't it's not justified to make investments now. You should just wait and see. It'd be much cheaper, let the growth continue, and then it'll be cheaper to pay off these issues later. Now, this shows you one of the problems with economics. Inherent in economics is in all areas of decision making, is this need to compare things which happen at different times. Costs and benefits don't happen generally to be coincident in time. If all the costs and all the benefits occur at the same instant in time, it becomes relatively easy to figure out what to do. But if the costs are bigger, you don't do it. And if the benefits are bigger, you do it. But as soon as they get spread over time, you have to somehow compare them. And that's what the discount rate does. It pulls everything back to the present, gives you a net present value, and then on the basis of that, presumably you know what to do. Let's look at what the assumptions are implicit in that. Using the discount rate on this issue of climate change has 5 important assumptions. Number 1, we do know the future consequences of our actions, not only what they're going to be, but when they're going to occur. I mean, you can't pull them back to the present if you don't even know what they are. So it's implicitly assumed that we can quantify them. Number 2, that we can assign prices to each of them, or costs, monetary indicators. Now, that typically means we have to go into the market to see what the right cost is. But anyway, the implicit assumption is that there's some monetary number which can be assigned to each of these things. The third assumption is that, in fact, the innate purpose of our species is to maximize net present value. Fourth assumption, implicit in Nordhaus's analysis and much of modern economics, is we get to pick the discount rate. Despite the fact that climate is going to have an impact 100 years from now, those people don't get to express their view on what our discount rate should be. We do. And of course, we're going to make it high, right? So that the costs are insignificant by the time they hit those people 100 years from now. The fifth assumption is that there are no irreversibilities, because as soon as you have an irreversibility, like a species extinction, or the loss of a town because there's no water there anymore, something like that, you can't put prices on that anymore. So you have to assume that you can buy back the consequences of all your mistakes. Every single one of those assumptions is wrong. Every one, for climate change. If you want to decide whether to buy a new car or fix your old car, discounted cash flow might be a very useful way to go about the decision. But when you're trying to decide what to do about climate, where you're trying, then every single one of those decisions or those assumptions is wrong, which means the whole notion of discounting is simply, it's not wrong, it's just irrelevant. It is not, has nothing to do with what really we ought to really be thinking about. So, and it's not only true, of course, with climate change, true with many other things as well, but it points out that we need new criteria. Another thing about climate change is where we tend to focus our attention. Climate change is caused by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. CO2 is actually not the most important greenhouse gas. Water vapor is more important in terms of heat trapping. But CO2 is the one that we have some control over, so that's the one we tend to focus on. That's what Kyoto talks about, for example. We know that CO2 is going up. We want it to go down, but it just keeps going up. And actually, it's going up faster now than ever before, parceling out economic difficulties. Why is that? Well, CO2 in the generation is a product of 4 different terms. Number of people, their standard of living, which means roughly the amount of capital that they have per person. And by that, I don't only mean your car, but you, for the moment, you're benefiting from a little bit of the capital of this club, and you're being affected, I don't know if it's a benefit, by the fact that there was an airplane which could fly me up here and stuff like that. So, number of people, amount of capital, the amount of energy required to operate the capital, because, of course, none of these things work if you don't have energy to run them. Your car is not very useful to you if you can't put gas in it. The bulbs are not very useful. You can't run electricity, et cetera. And then the fourth factor is the percent of that energy that comes from fossil fuels. So CO2 is going up because the product of population, standard of living, energy intensity, and fraction renewable, that product is going up. Now look at where we're putting our energy, our efforts. We focus all of our money and all of our time on the technological side. We're trying to increase the solar fraction, and we're trying to increase energy efficiency. Population growth and standard of living, totally off the table. I'll tell you as a system scientist, as long as you have exponential growth in population, as long as increasing the standard of living is the unassumed or explicit goal of everybody, they will dominate the equation, and they will offset any improvements you could possibly make over on the solar fraction and the energy efficiency, which means CO2 will keep going up. It's been going up, and it's going to keep going up until we can pull out of our economic preoccupations and look at the broader picture. Let me just illustrate that with one quick exercise, gestion the rest of my speech, and then come to a snappy conclusion here. This kind of illustrates this issue of sustainable development. I have two pens here. This one is made out of cardboard and recyclable plastic, and it's really cheap. It probably, I don't know, cost like 10 cents. They gave them away, actually, at the place I got them. And this one is a Mont Blanc pen. It costs 350 bucks. It's made out of platinum and precious resins and all that kind of stuff. Question: which is more sustainable? Well, let me tell you some more about these two pens. This today is the first time I've taken this out of my office since I got it. I'm speaking truly. Normally I show a picture of it, but I didn't have a chance to show a picture, so I said, for this group, they're going to get the real thing. Why? Because I lose pens. If I took this around with me, I would lose it, for sure. I'd be incredibly unhappy, but I would lose it. So I keep it at home, and when I die, I'm going to pass it on to somebody, some friend probably, and they'll keep it for a long time. And when it runs out of ink, I buy a new cartridge and keep it going. It works really well. This one, I lose these all the time. I get them a dozen at a time. I try not to lose them, but they just get lost. And when they run out of ink, if I ever have one that long, I throw it away. Now, which is more sustainable? You see, it's not so simple. But the key thing to say here is sustainability is not in the thing. It's in the relationship. Unless you know about my habits of use, my values, the trade-offs I make, you can't know which of these is more sustainable. So when somebody starts talking about making a city more sustainable or which car is more sustainable, you realize they are asking the question in a way which cannot be answered. They're assuming that sustainability is in the thing and not in the relationship. A Hummer could conceivably be more sustainable than a Prius if you put the Hummer up on a pedestal, never drove it anywhere, and used it as a piece of art. It's not my style, but I mean, to make a point. Okay, so as long as we keep trying to solve this problem with technical measures and leave the whole social side out, it's too late for sustainable development. We can do things. We can move towards an emphasis on resilience. We can change our criteria and so forth, but we're going to have to change our habits a lot. And in my concluding remarks, I'm going to give you a little practice on how to do that, because in this example, you'll learn a couple of crucial things about the more interesting process of moving towards a more sustainable society. So I ask all of you, cross your arms. Look down and see which wrist is on top. Okay, now drop your arms. Great. Now cross your arms. Look down and see which wrist is on top. Now we're going to do a little survey here. Everyone who had the same wrist on top both times, raise your hand. Almost everybody. Almost everybody. So there must be an optimum, I guess. Let's see what it is. Everyone who had their left wrist up both times, raise your hand. Everyone who had the right wrist up both times, raise your hand. About 50-50.
What about those that changed?
Some people, I don't like to point out that some people can't remember anymore. Or are, so what this shows is you do it the same way time after time. Why? Because you get into a habit. It's great to have a habit. Habits are wonderful. And why do you have this habit? Well, because there are a lot of things you want to do that don't require your hands. And if you had to sit there for 10 minutes each time trying to figure out what you're going to do with your arms before you could get on with the job, it'd be a real waste of time. So you get a habit. This gets your hands out of the way, and now you can move on with your life. And that's terrific. But sometimes circumstances change. Cross your arms the other way. Okay. This shows you three things. You see, sustainability is like this. We've gotten ourselves into these problems because we've just had a set of habits, energy use, lifestyle norms, and so forth, which we have to change now. And when you change your arm habit, you see three things. First, it's possible. You did it, I think. I mean, I didn't check, but I'm sure you did it. Two, you have to think about it and maybe make mistakes and experiment even, conceivably. But you do it. And third, it doesn't feel very comfortable at first. When you change your habits, it's not comfortable. So that's what it's going to be like if we could manage to get off onto a different path. We can do it. But we're going to have to think about it. We're going to make mistakes. And a lot of us are going to be uncomfortable. But eventually, we'll manage. Thank you.
Questions? Comments?
Dennis, I just wanted to comment on your discount rate issue. I think both Nordhaus and Nick got it wrong. I think it should be a zero discount rate, and the arguments for that are that climate change is not a flow problem, it's a disincrement and increment to stock. And if you have a 20-year obligation, let's say, to reduce your part of that stock, you're quite indifferent potentially as to whether you do it day one, or at least in terms of impact, day one or year one or year 20. So you can make, I think, a very plausible case that climate change should always use a zero discount rate.
The thing is, as soon as I accept your suggestion and set the discount rate to zero, I'm immediately buying into an approach which is based on 5 fundamental errors. A zero discount rate still assumes you know what's going to happen. It still assumes you can assign costs to those, etc. I think we need something totally different. Something like the precautionary principle, which is being pushed in Europe, or what my mom used to tell me, if you can't afford to lose, don't gamble, or something else. It is not simply a matter of picking a different discount rate. It just isn't. If you buy into that, you're locked into a process which is going to fail. That's my sense. Other questions? I'm sure, as you know, Ian knows more about this than I do, so he could come back with all sorts of, but we'll do that afterwards, so go ahead.
I want to make a comment on something you said this morning, and it's a correction. And I'm not sure if you're going to like it or not, but you mentioned Canada had reached peak oil or peak gas in 2001, and that is correct. We did.
2001.
Yes. However, since then we've discovered two huge fields, one in northeastern BC that runs into Yukon, the other one in northeastern BC runs into Alberta. One's called the Horn Field, the other one's the Moseley. They're so big that we now have a glut of gas. Yesterday, the Chinese...
If you have a glut of gas, why is your gas production going down?
It's going down because you have a glut as well in the States. What we are doing now, and we saw a consequence yesterday, the Chinese National Oil Company bought one of the largest owners of the Horn Field, or the Moseley Field. We now have two proposals to build a pipeline from northeastern BC to Kitimat, BC, make liquid natural gas terminals and ship natural gas to Asia. So I'm just pointing out how we had peak gas, but now we've got 10 times more than we had 9 years ago.
What you just said doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry, it's probably my mistake, but we could talk about it. One thing, and let me say I'm not a specialist in Canadian energy, although a very close friend of mine was the senior fossil fuel geologist for the Canadian Geological Survey before he retired. And now that he's retired, he says he's able to tell the truth. And he says, you got a big problem. Now, that's my source of information. It may not be very good, but it's not my own. I don't know. But a key issue here is not to get confused by the difference between the stock and the flow. You can have an enormous amount of water in your bathtub, but if it's, bleeding out through a microscopic hole, you're going to die of dehydration, despite the fact you have a lot of water there because the flow is so small. The so-called non-conventional fossil sources that you're starting to talk about, fractured gas, conversion of tar sands and so forth, have that attribute. The stock is high, but the flow, if we start to think about it and what its implications are for the environment, for capital requirements, very low. So we need not to look at the stock to decide whether there's a peak issue here. We need to look at the flow. And what I do know is that your flow has been going down since before non-conventional gas became a big issue in the United States. My friend, who may be wrong, of course, says that your gas production is going to be less than your gas requirements within some decades. And you say no. You think there's going to be gas forever. I hope you're right.
No, I don't say there's going to be gas forever, but we've got too much. The price reflects it. The price has dropped very dramatically in the last 2 years, and we're getting ready to export natural gas to Asia.
Well, one thing I'm working on at the moment is a peak energy game. It's a management planning game. It does show, trying to get back to the bigger picture here, it does illustrate this issue. Your talk about gas tends to be in terms of price, profits, export income, and probably tax revenues for the provinces, profits of the companies, and so forth. You're choosing to look at it at a moment in time and through an economic lens. I was born in 1942. 85% of all the fossil fuel, 85% of all the fossil fuel that has ever been used in all of human history has been used since I was born. And by the time I die, my guess is that 85% of the oil, which is ever going to be used in humans, will have been used. Don't forget, our species has been on this planet for a couple 100,000 years. We're now talking about an incredibly unique resource which will come and go in decades. And it's a mistake well, it's maybe not a mistake, but be clear what you're doing. You're applying, you're basically saying it's up to you to decide how quickly to use that stuff. Let's don't ask the people who are going to be around 100 years from now what they would have liked us to do. If we constitute, I have a friend in Hungary who works for something called the, I don't know what it is, Council for Future Generations, et cetera. His goal is, through his staff, to bring into the legislative deliberations some thoughts about the criteria and the preferences of future generations. They're wiping them out. It's too inconvenient to introduce that into the political discussion. Okay, well, now what we do, we're going to break into little groups or something. Yeah. I know it's frustrating for you. It's frustrating for me too, but because I know you're wrong and you know I'm wrong, and we didn't get a chance to prove it. So, that's life.